William Wallace. I mean, the name itself is legendary, right? You've definitely seen the movie. He's this giant figure, one of history's most famous freedom fighters. But, the real story, well, that's way more complex. And honestly, even more fascinating than the legend.
So be honest, when you hear that name, what pops into your head? Is it the blue face paint, a warrior on a horse screaming freedom? Yeah, that's the Hollywood version for sure. So today, what we're going to do is dig into what the actual historical records say and try to answer that one big question. Who was the real William Wallace? All right, so let's get right into it. If we really want to find the man behind the myth, we've got to peel back, almost 700 years of stories, legends, and straight-up fiction. We need to see what the actual, historical documents can tell us about who he really was. Okay, first things first, let's bust the biggest myth right out of the gate. He was not just some humble farmer. Not at all. The real William Wallace was actually born into the gentry. He was part of Scotland's lesser nobility. And that's a huge deal, right? Because it means he had some status, he had connections, and critically, he probably had military training. And that's going to become super important. Even his name gives us a really fascinating clue. The name Wallace most likely comes from an Old English word, Willish, which basically means foreigner or Welshman. It just kind of hints at this really complex cultural soup that was medieval Scotland, and suggests that maybe generations back, his family were seen as outsiders. So what did the guy actually look like? Well, we don't have any portraits, obviously, but we do have this description from a chronicler named Walter Bower, who was writing not too long after Wallace's time. And he paints this picture of a physically massive dude, a tall man with the body of a giant. This was someone who would have absolutely dominated the room, or the battlefield. But here's the thing. Heroes, especially guys like Wallace, they don't just pop up out of nowhere. To really get why he rose to power, you have to understand the absolute crisis that Scotland was in. The whole country was in chaos. And his story, you just can't separate it from that national disaster. And this timeline, wow, it just shows how fast things went south. It's a total disaster. In 1286, the king suddenly dies. Okay, big problem. Then his only heir, a little girl, dies just 4 years later on her way to Scotland. So now there's no clear successor. The country is basically on the verge of civil war. And who steps in? England's King Edward I, saying, "Don't worry, I'll be the referee here." He picks a new Scottish king, but then, piece by piece, he just strips him of all his power until he can just walk in, invade, and declare himself the ruler of Scotland, just like that. So now you've got Scotland under full-on English military occupation. The stage is perfectly set for a rebellion. And this is the moment that William Wallace, this minor noble we've been talking about, steps out of the shadows and onto the world stage.
And his rebellion? It didn't start with some big, inspiring speech. Nope. According to the records, it kicked off with a single brutal act in May 1297. He killed the English High Sheriff of Lanark. And with that one move, he instantly became public enemy number one for the English crown, and, at the same time, a hero for a whole lot of Scots. And that one act of rebellion? It snowballed, and it led directly to his tactical masterpiece, the Battle of Stirling Bridge. Just look at how this played out. The English army was way bigger, way better equipped, but they had a fatal flaw in their path, a really narrow bridge. So what did Wallace and his co-commander, Andrew Moray, do? They didn't just charge, no way. They waited, they were patient. They let about half of the English army get across, trapping them, and then they attacked. It was an absolutely stunning victory, completely against the odds. And if you want to understand just how brutal this war was, listen to this. The English treasurer in Scotland, a guy named Hugh de Cressingham, who was deeply hated, by the way, was killed in the battle, and according to one chronicle, they flayed his body, and Wallace himself supposedly had a strip of his skin made into a belt for his sword. Think about that. This wasn't some clean, knights in shining armor kind of war. It was raw, it was personal, and it was unbelievably vicious. So after Stirling Bridge, Wallace's rise was just astronomical. And this is where it gets really interesting, right? He wasn't one of the big shot lords of Scotland. He was this minor noble, but he was leading a popular rebellion. And because of this massive victory, he gets knighted and named a guardian of the Kingdom of Scotland. He was, for all intents and purposes, running the country in the name of their exiled king. It's an incredible leap in status. But there was a problem. King Edward I. This was not a guy who took defeat well. Not at all. He was one of the most ruthless military commanders of his time, and he was
absolutely furious. So Wallace had reached the peak of his power, but a very, very sharp fall was coming for him. So the big question is, how did it all go so wrong just a year later at the Battle of Falkirk? Well, this slide really explains it perfectly. At Stirling Bridge, the terrain was everything. It was the Scots' secret weapon. But at Falkirk, Edward I wasn't going to make the same mistake twice. He came prepared. He had an answer to Wallace's famous spear formations, those schiltrons, which were basically these tight circles of spearmen like human hedgehogs. And that answer was a devastating new weapon, the Welsh longbow. His archers just stood back and rained down thousands of arrows, tearing the Scottish formations apart before the knights even had to charge. It was a complete and utter disaster for the Scots. After a defeat like that, his military reputation was, in tatters. So after Falkirk, Wallace actually resigns as guardian, but he doesn't quit. He takes on a totally new role, diplomat. He heads off to France, maybe even to Rome, and he's not just there with his hat in his hand begging for help. He's making a strategic argument for Scotland's right to exist as an independent kingdom. He's looking for allies, for money, for troops, anything to keep the fight going. And you can see from this timeline of his final years, the man just did not give up. He spends years overseas trying to get support, and then he comes back to Scotland to keep fighting. But this time, it's more of a guerrilla war. By now, though, he's a fugitive. He is, without a doubt, the most wanted man in all of Britain. And then it happened. On August 5th, 1305, he was betrayed. And what's worse, it was by a fellow Scot, a knight loyal to King Edward. He was captured, dragged all the way to London, and put on a show trial at Westminster Hall. The charge? The worst one you could face: high treason. But Wallace, even then, had this powerful defense. And honestly, it was a pretty solid legal argument. He basically said, how can I be a traitor to King Edward? I was never his subject. See, he had never sworn an oath of loyalty to the English king. So from his point of view, it was impossible for him to be a traitor. It's a brilliant bit of defiance, really. Of course, his legal argument meant nothing. The trial was a sham, just for show. Edward wanted to send a message, and that message was his sentence: to be hanged, drawn, and quartered. And this list shows just how horrific and calculated it was. This wasn't just an execution. It was a form of state-sponsored terrorism, designed to horrify and intimidate anyone else who might even think of defying England. But here's the thing. That horrific death, it wasn't the end of his story. Not by a long shot. In a strange way, it was actually the beginning of his legend. Edward's plan to make an example of him, it was about to backfire in the most spectacular way imaginable. And this really is the ultimate irony, isn't it? By making his execution so public, so unbelievably brutal, Edward didn't crush the Scottish rebellion. He fueled it. He accidentally gave them their most powerful weapon, a martyr. He turned a failed rebel into an immortal symbol of defiance that would fire up the Scots for centuries. And that symbol, that martyr, became the seed for centuries of storytelling. As you can see here, his story just got bigger and bigger over time. First, you had these epic poems in the 1400s, which is where a lot of the fictional stuff comes from. Then, centuries later, it was romanticized by famous writers like Robert Burns. And then, of course, in the 20th century, Hollywood got a hold of it and blasted it out to a massive global audience. So, when you boil it all down, why does he still matter so much today? What's the big takeaway? I think it's this. Today, William Wallace is remembered less for the nitty-gritty historical details of his actual life, and more as something bigger. He's become this powerful global symbol for anyone fighting for freedom against impossible odds. And his entire legacy might just be perfectly summed up by this Latin inscription. It's on a memorial plaque near where he was executed, and it's a message he was supposedly taught as a kid. It translates to, I tell you the truth, freedom is what is best. Son, never live your life like a slave. And it's that one powerful idea, that one principle, that took a Scottish knight from the 13th century and turned him into a legend that will never die.